what is ACE2 receptor and what has this to do with all the COVID vaccines, what does it do in our body, and also why is it important in terms of wearing a mask. I hope you all are doing well. For all of you who are new to my channel, welcome, and all of you who are back to my channel, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about ACE2 receptor and why is it important to understand the functionality of the ACE2 receptor in the body in terms of understanding how all the COVID-19 vaccines work, as well as you will be much more smarter after this video to understand why we need to wear masks and what has this to do with wearing a mask. I really wish that everyone else out there, all the officials, would have talked about this in this clear detail, so you would have been better understanding what does this all mean. And I hope after this video you will be able to become much more smarter about all the vaccines, all the mask wearing, not social media smart, but really smart, scientifically smart. So let's get started. So I was about to shoot a video on the difference between Novavax and Covaxin, and I will definitely do this after this video, but I will also, as a surprise, I will add another very important vaccine which goes completely under the radar, and I will add that vaccine also to that video. So if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so when I upload that video you will be informed. Before going into all the details about the vaccine, I thought, wait a second, so let me first explain ACE2 receptor so that we can backtrack just a second and understand the mechanism of all the vaccines. I know there's so many information, everybody's like talking about all of this data. People who even don't understand data just are floating you, bombarding you with all the data, or just people just generally bombard information. So it's like this information overload. So please, let's backtrack a second. So what is ACE2 receptor and what has this to do with all the COVID vaccines? What does it do in our body? And also, why is it important in terms of wearing a mask? So ACE2 is literally the key door or the entrance of the SARS-CoV-2 virus into our cells and into our body. The ACE2 is a receptor on the cell surface. Say this is a cell and this is on the cell surface a receptor. So it captures a protein that is specific to the receptor. But the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, using its spike-like protein, fits perfectly to the ACE2 receptor in our body, on our cells. And in which cells, in which organs, I will talk about this in a second, but it binds such in a perfect way, like a key and a keyhole. It fits perfectly on it. It binds to it and then it enters from there into the body. So it actually activates the cell so that it can go inside the cell. And then it spreads from there. It does its own cycle and produces a lot of viruses that can then exit the cell and then infect all the other cells around it, and then does the same thing, expansion in those cells, and then expand and lyses the cells and then goes to the other cells, infect those cells, and then lyses those cells and spread around the entire body. So this is basically the entrance door, that ACE2 receptor is the entrance door of the SARS-CoV-2 virus into our body. So now let's talk about where in our body are these ACE2 receptors naturally, because we have these receptors naturally in our body. These receptors are found on epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are certain tissues creating a protective barrier. So mainly these ACE2 receptors can be found in lungs, in the lung cells and the lung epithelium, in blood vessels, in the heart, in the liver, in kidneys, in the gastrointestinal tract, as well as in the brain. So now think about, I will do another video about long COVID and also the symptoms we are seeing after the disease or after the viral infection, after COVID-19. Then you will be able to understand when I talk about lungs, when I talk about brain, when I talk about GI issues, right? So all of these are largely, or like heart. So these are fitting perfectly where the receptor is locating. So that's why it's important to understand the basics first. So as I said, naturally ACE2 receptors found in lungs, in the epithelial tissue, in the cells of the epithelial tissue in the lungs, in the heart, in blood vessels, in the liver, in the kidneys, in the gastrointestinal tract, and in the brain. These are all included, but it is not just those, right? Mainly they are located in these organs, and of course in many other places in our body too. So what does it naturally do? Let's talk about what the ACE2 receptor does in our body. What is it good for? So the ACE2 receptor binds protein, which is an enzyme that cleaves the large angiotensin protein and creates sub-angiotensins like the angiotensin II. Large amount of angiotensin II is creating the high blood pressure, the damage to the blood vessels, creates wounds and also inflammation. So the ACE2 receptor blocks or inhibits the ACE2 protein so that the angiotensin II is not extremely highly expressed, so that the wound healing can take place, the inflammation is reduced, the blood vessels are not damaged, and also the blood pressure is also in place, or it is where it's supposed to be, it's normalized. But again, if the angiotensin II, if it's highly expressed, if it's highly there, because either if you inhibit the ACE2 receptor, then the angiotensin II will be in large amounts and then causes all these damages. So therefore, this is like a nice back and forth relationship or interaction, so that the ACE2 receptor and the protein are working hand in hand to balance out the body's function in terms of all these things that I mentioned: blood pressure, wound healing, blood vessel damage, and inflammation, etc. So now let's talk about, here in this schematic, the ACE2 receptor. As you can see here, this is the host cell, like our human body cell, and this is our ACE2 receptor. ACE2 receptor. This is the virus. So what you can see here is that the virus has these spike proteins, and I will show another schematic, and there you will see the exact spike protein binding domain, the binding domain of the spike protein to the ACE receptor of the host cell. And once the virus binds with the spike protein to the ACE receptor, it enables the virus to enter into the host cell. And as I mentioned, it goes on from there and then multiplies and then lyses the cell and goes to the next cell. What I would like to add here is that we mentioned that the ACE2 receptor is present in the nose, mouth, and highly abundant on the type 2 pneumocytes in the lungs. These cell types in the lungs are important within the alveoli. In the alveoli, oxygen is absorbed and carbon dioxide is released. So as you can see, the ACE2 receptor, and because it's highly present in the type 2 pneumocytes within the alveoli where the oxygen carbon dioxide is absorbed and released, so therefore as you can imagine that the COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus can cause multiple damages to the lung. And in fact, when a person has COVID-19, then as we mentioned before, that the receptor is blocked by the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, correct? And therefore the angiotensin II was in excess, correct? And because of this increase of angiotensin II, people with COVID have increased amount of inflammation and death of the cells in the alveoli. And now you can understand what this means in terms of why a person can simply not breathe and has to be on a ventilator. Because literally the cells that makes these exchanges of the oxygen and carbon dioxide are dying. And the inflammation is high, and therefore the COVID causes a huge damage in the lung in this regard once it binds to the ACE receptor, causing the increase of the angiotensin II. Okay, and also would like to add here that myocarditis, because we know that, as I mentioned in the beginning, the ACE receptors are also present in the blood vessels and in the heart, and therefore inflammation in myocarditis can also occur people with COVID. And this is all of the reasons. And kidney diseases, liver, digestive tract can all be injured because of the ACE2 receptor blocked by the spike protein of the virus. So generally speaking, when people have already hypertension, heart failure, and kidney disease, so those patients already have ACE inhibitor drugs or ARB drugs. I want to tell you some of them. The ACE inhibitor drugs are the ones that blocks the ACE, which blocks the cleavage of the angiotensin II, and also the ARB blocks the angiotensin II type 1 receptor. So as I mentioned, that COVID can also largely affect people with hypertension. Those patients already receiving ACE inhibitor drugs or ARB drugs. So let me tell you a little bit more about those so that you can understand how the mechanism actually works for them. And here is that the angiotensin converting enzyme, the ACE, is also found in the tissues like the lung and the heart. And in those, as we learned in the beginning, in these organs, ACE2 receptor is present as well, correct? The drugs that are inhibit the ACE1 are called ACE inhibitors. So angiotensin 1 inhibitors are called ACE inhibitors. And example for those can be ramipril, lisinopril, and enalapril. Those are the examples for angiotensin 1 inhibitors. These drugs are blocking the angiotensin 1 but not the ACE2. And the ACE1 drives the production of the angiotensin 2. And we all know from the beginning what it means when the angiotensin 2 is driven up high. So the ACE increases the amount of angiotensin 2, whereas the ACE2 reduces the angiotensin 2. Right? This is what we said in the beginning. So the angiotensin 1 increases the angiotensin 2, and because of this damage, the ACE drugs that block angiotensin 1 helpful for people who have high hypertension and heart diseases so that the angiotensin 2 is reduced. And the ACE2 is the one that reduces the angiotensin 2. So because if it's in this high amount, the angiotensin 2, we need to also block this angiotensin 2 so that the ACE2 can do its job to reduce the amount of angiotensin 2 so that it can balance the damage for the blood vessels, for the heart, or the cause of inflammation, and also the hypertension, etc. So these angiotensin 2 inhibitors, which are called ARBs or angiotensin receptor blockers, ARBs. An example for those can be losartan. If you have people with hypertension, you might be familiar with these medications. Losartan, valsartan, etc. So these are angiotensin 2 receptor blockers. So blocker here, if it's in the amount. So those are generally speaking for the people who have these diseases. So I hope you could now understand the interaction between angiotensin 2, ACE2, and how COVID can cause the damage. And when we look into this dynamic, especially why it is so dangerous for people who already have heart disease, who are already diabetic, or who already have liver, kidney diseases, rare genetic diseases that affects the blood vessels because of this dynamic between angiotensin 2 and the ACE2 receptor. Okay, I hope this is now clear. And by the way, of course, with the inflammation and myocarditis, etc. So it's because of these interaction with the ACE2 and angiotensin. So let's talk about, I want to show you here from two papers. Both were published in 2020. And some mechanism here actually in this picture from this paper, and I will link these papers down in the description box so you can read it from there if you are interested. So but I would like to focus on this picture here where I will explain the systems that are now out there which are blocking effectively the ACE2 receptor. And also in this picture from this paper, I want to actually just focus on this picture here. Let me do that. This picture is nice because I wanted to show you much more closer how this actually works. So here the angiotensin converting enzyme ACE2 receptor, here the human target cell, which the virus is using, in this case is SARS-CoV-2, is using to enter into the host cell, right? And also here, so this is the receptor right here, the ACE2 receptor. And as I mentioned in the beginning that the virus has a binding domain, the receptor binding domain RBD of the spike protein right here, that, as you can see, has a fantastic match, like 100% match. So this is how it works with receptors and the proteins. So they are like key and the keyhole. They fit like 100% to each other. So therefore, it is important that we block this angiotensin converting enzyme or ACE2 receptor so that the virus cannot enter into the body. And I want to show you how we're going to do that, or how we are doing that. So, and I'm referring to this paper here, to this picture. Okay, so as you can see in this picture, there are 4 main ways we are now targeting the ACE2 receptor. The SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies, that's the vaccine. All the vaccines. When we talk about neutralizing antibody, that's what it is. Because with the neutralizing antibody against the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, we are able to have these antibodies, or able to develop these antibodies that actually now binds to the spike protein right here, binds to the spike protein, and therefore it inhibits its binding to the ACE receptor on the host cell. That's what it means, neutralizing antibody. So the antibodies that are developed because of the vaccine or through the vaccines, these antibodies are binding, the spike protein specific antibodies are binding to the virus's spike protein on its surface, and therefore the binding of the virus to the ACE2 receptor is blocked, is inhibited. The other way is peptide-based binders. So there are these small peptides that are based on the spike proteins, like similar to the antibodies, but those are small peptides binding to the receptor of the virus and therefore blocking or inhibiting the binding to the ACE2 receptor. That's another way. The third way is to, and I want to have you focus on this protein here. This is TMPRSS2. I know it's a long name, but what it is that this protein is a transmembrane protein. What that means is, as you can see, it goes through, it's a transmembrane. This is the membrane of the cell, so the cells goes all the way like this, and this is a cell surface, or like the cell membrane, and the transmembrane means that this protein goes through like the receptor to the cell membrane. And not only the SARS-CoV-2 but the corona SARS-CoV-1 and also MERS and also influenza viruses, they all use this TMPRSS2 transmembrane protein in order to enter into the cell as well. But when we also block with fusion blockers the transmembrane domain, the TMPRSS2, we are also enable the viruses not enter into the cell. However, with different types of mutation, we can still enable the virus. When the virus mutates, they can find a way to still enter into the cell by the means of ACE2 receptor. And what the scientists now are doing, or finding to be effective, using decoy receptors. I love decoy because in my PhD so many years ago, I used decoy, and that was a brand new thing that time, decoy oligonucleotides for gene therapy to block certain genes, therefore expression of certain proteins which are important for cancer development, etc. But in this case, what the scientists are doing, they find to be effective, which, and I love the strategy, is that you create a fake, this is the simplified word, but you engineer, basically molecular engineer, a ACE2 receptor, which is exactly like this part, exactly 100% the same as this, and you give these decoy receptors in excess into the cell. You enter them into the cell in excess, and what it does is that it fakes the ACE2 receptor and manipulates basically the virus, thinking that, oh wow, here's an ACE2 receptor, let me go bind to it. And because it is in excess, there's a chance that the virus binds more to this decoy receptors than to the natural ACE2 receptors. And the researchers now find this to be effective in vitro studies. Okay? Let's talk about COVID-19, so SARS-CoV-2. When SARS-CoV-2 enters into the body, these receptors are in the mouth, in the nose, and in the lungs. So these receptors largely found in the nose, in the epithelial cells of the nose, mouth, and lungs. So when we do not wear masks, let's say, it comes into our nose, into our mouth, and enters into our body through the ACE2 receptors, then what does the spike protein blocks basically, right? Because it binds to it. And so it binds to the ACE2 receptor and blocks the receptor. So now the receptor is occupied. And because it is occupied, it does not regulate the angiotensin II anymore. This means it is now in excess, and because of that, it can cause blood vessel damage, it can cause inflammation, it can cause high blood pressure, heart palpitations, and all that, because generally the people with high blood pressure, they take these medicine in order to balance this angiotensin mechanism. But again, when SARS-CoV-2 blocks, or the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 blocks or occupies the receptors of ACE2, then the angiotensin II is not regulated and causes all the damage. So here becomes this question, why some people are more infected or get more damage than the other. So what you need to understand is also in biology, when we also work on gene therapy or cellular therapy, we oftentimes look at the amount of receptors on each cell. We still don't know if more cell receptors, if it's on the cell, if it's a good thing or bad thing, or what does it do. And the binding, is it strongly binding or is it loosely binding? So those are all factors which we still don't know. Generally in cellular therapy, let's say in CAR T cell therapy, we also don't know, but in generally with cellular therapy we don't know. But with SARS-CoV-2 we also do not know what does this really affecting. So is it the amount of the receptors on the cell that causes this, or is it the binding strength and what have you? So we just don't know that as well, and therefore we cannot assume. In this case, we just don't know what exactly the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, whom does it more damage than to the other. So that is overall the background about ACE2 receptor. So let's talk about the vaccine. Actually, there are 4 types of vaccines right now out there. So one set is the mRNA based vaccine, and those are coming from Pfizer and BioNTech as well as from Moderna. The other ones are adenovirus based. Those are coming from J&J as well as from AstraZeneca. Then we have a first protein-based COVID-19 vaccine, and that comes from Novavax. Then we have inactivated that come from Covaxin and Sinovac. Those are these vaccines that are generally the types of vaccine out there. Except of Sinovac and Covaxin, all the other 3 that I mentioned, all the other 3 groups, the mRNA, adenovirus, as well as the protein-based Novavax vaccine, they all are focused on the spike protein. Therefore, will inactivate the further binding of the viruses and enter into the cell. That will also bring me in the next video about the differences of having a full virus, an inactivated virus, which also have obviously the spike protein in order to enter into cells. So all of them are able to bind to the ACE2 receptor. Here's what you need to understand. So as I said, the virus cycle is that once it enters into the door of the cell, it produces a lot of viruses that then lyses the cell and goes out and then infects all the other cells. And then each virus expanded in numbers in each cell, and they go on and then infect the other cell. So the amount of the viruses inside the body is exponentially growing after the infection. Therefore, it is absolutely critical that we block these viruses from entering into the door and expanding inside the cell and go on to infect other cells and other cells and other cells in excess. And when we sneeze, the aerosols, all the virus particles, and then when we do not wear a mask, all these virus particles enter into our nose, as I just mentioned in the beginning, through our nose, through our mouth, through the ACE2 receptors. They are in excess there, and then get into the lungs, where we have in excess also the ACE2 receptors. So therefore, to block that circle, the vaccines help to block these entrance door. And if they have this short term or maybe long term, depends on the person, with, as I said, as we know, as we heard everywhere, when they have heart issue, hypertension issue, when they have certain other, because of the inflammation, if they are immunocompromised, or if they have other, autoimmune diseases, those are in the risk group with these vaccines, right? We talk about the healthy people right now. When we have the vaccines and these ACE2 doors are blocked, then the virus cannot enter, and that's the whole point of the vaccine. Okay, I hope this was helpful to you. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comment box below. I really hope this was helpful. I was able to explain to you the science of it and the background of it before even going further into this vaccine and that vaccine, and this was able to help you understand why wearing a mask is also very, very critical, and wearing a mask properly with the nose and the mouth both covered, not just the mouth. Okay, so thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video where I explain Novavax and Covaxin, and I have another vaccine I'm going to talk about there as well. See you there. Bye-bye.